Hey, what's going on, guys? Realm Gaming here, back into the video. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at some of the easiest healers for Mythic Plus in Season 1 of the War Within. And this tier list is going to be a little bit more catered towards beginner healers. So what are the best healers to pick up for a beginner? So if you are somebody who is pretty much in the loop with how all the healing specializations play, this video is probably not going to be for you. There's going to be no sort of surprises in this one. This is going to be mainly for people who are brand new to the game and just kind of dipping their toes into healing. And I'm just going to try to give a general overview of how each spec plays and just why or why not they might be easier or harder to pick up for a new player. Okay, so first on the list is going to be Restoration Druid. And at the moment, Wildstalker is performing quite a bit better than Keeper of the Grove in Mythic Plus. Seems to be what most high-end Restoration Druids are running. So what this means is you're going to have two specs that you're kind of going in and out of, or two different forms, excuse me. You're going to have your normal form, and you're also going to have your cat form. Now, you also have things like bear form as well, which you can utilize to kind of soak damage to the extra stamina that you get. But for the most part, you're in your normal form and your cat form. So what this means is you're going to have a lot of things to track. So you have heal over time effects that you'll have to track, and they will constantly be falling off in combat. And then you also have damage over time effects that you'll have to constantly reapply, which will fall off over time in combat. So for beginners specifically, I would say Restoration Druid is going to be one of the harder healers to play just due to how much there is to track. And you don't necessarily have to use abilities in specific orders. However, you just have a lot of things that are happening all at once, and it can feel very overwhelming to play. Now, with that being said, they typically do a little bit better with mana management than a lot of the other healers on this list. And a lot of that has to do with this thriving growth hero talent here. If we look at the second paragraph, wild growth, regrowth, and efflorescence healing has a chance to cause symbiotic blooms to grow on the target, healing for 120% spell power over 6 seconds. So this kind of gives Restoration Druid some of that burst healing that they really need. And it kind of helps offset the proactive feel that kind of comes naturally from Restoration Druid. So typically, historically, you have to apply hots before the damage comes out, and that's still pretty true for the most part. And then Symbiotic Blooms here just kind of helps offset that with a lot of the passive healing that it grants us. So overall, with Restoration Druid, you are managing 2 to 3 different forms, and you are tracking a whole bunch of different spells, both on the healing and the damage side. So for these reasons, we'll go ahead and put them at C tier. So I do think that overall they are one of the more difficult healers to pick up at the moment. Up next, let's go ahead and take a look at Preservation Evoker. So Preservation Evoker has two trees that are both pretty viable at the moment. You can either run Chrono Warden or you can run Flame Shaper, but I think most people at the moment are running Chrono Warden. So Preservation Evoker is going to be one of those healers that kind of get better as keys go higher and higher, because they have a lot of percentage-based healing based on damage taken. So what I mean by that is if we look at the spell here called Reversion, so if we look at the blue part, Golden Hour, instantly healing them for 15% of the damage taken in the last 5 seconds. So we kind of see this sort of common pattern throughout their entire tree through different spells like Rewind, and you can kind of use time to reverse a lot of the damage that they've taken. So naturally, as damage goes up through keys, their healing gets stronger, because basically they're able to reverse all that damage taken back into health. So they're very, very good at burst healing, and they're also very good with boss mechanics where predictable damage patterns are going to happen, because you have this sort of set of combos that you're playing around, and they're just extremely potent when the combos are pulled off properly. Now, that big advantage is also one of their biggest weaknesses, especially for beginners, is you kind of have to play this specialization in a very specific way. And it takes a very deep understanding of both their tree and every single spell on how they work, because no other healer plays even remotely close to anything like Preservation Evoker. And if you don't use their combos and their very specific ways that they're kind of designed to play, this is almost one of those healers that's, I don't want to say it's unplayable, but it's much more difficult to play than anything else on this list. And then Preservation Evoker, the other thing that they have going against them is they have range limitations. So they have probably the shortest range out of any of the healers on this list. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to run with Preservation Evoker if you're running, let's just say, for example, with a whole bunch of ranged DPS, people that are spread out all over the place. Preservation Evoker has a lot of cone targeted abilities that requires people to be stacked up to do healing. And if you're not running with melee comps, they are going to be kind of difficult to play. So for these reasons, I'm going to put them in D tier. I think that they will be probably the hardest healer to pick up for beginners on this list. Okay, up next on this list, we have Mistweaver Monk. So Mistweaver Monk has a very unique play style, and you're going to have to really dive into the tree, kind of similar to Preservation Evoker if you really want to understand how it heals. So this will be another one of those specs that will require a bit of research before all three of these specs are probably going to require the most research on this list in terms of how you play them. And you're really going to have to kind of dive into trees, into talent trees to understand where their synergies are coming from. However, one of the pros with Mistweaver Monk is they have a lot of passive healing. So you heal through your damage on Mistweaver Monk. Unlike these other specs where they're kind of more point and click, on Mistweaver Monk, you just kind of do your damage and health bars just kind of go up, which is really nice. So Mistweaver Monk is currently running Conduit of the Celestials, and they have a bunch of really low cooldown, powerful healing spells. And this is going to be one of their major pros is whenever a situation goes bad, they typically always have a button to press. So we have spells like our Celestial Conduit. We have spells like our Shalen's Gift. We have our 1 minute cooldown Red Crane. This goes down to about a minute and a half, I believe, through talents. It says 3 minutes here, but it goes much lower. We have spells like our Life Cocoon, which goes lower than this. Through talents, we have our Revival. So there's just a button to press for any sort of situation, which is really nice. And then the other thing that's really nice about them is, it's just a very passive healing rotation. You go in, you press your typical 4 to 5 buttons, you do damage, health bars go up. So pretty chill to play for the most part once you get the hang of fist weaving. And there's also, Mistweaver also has sort of like combos very similar to something like a Preservation Evoker, but they're not nearly as in depth. Such as, for example, when you're casting your Soothing Mist, if you have an Enveloping Mist on the target, then your Vivifies become instant cast. So there is sort of that hidden level of complexity with them. You also have things like casting Thunder Focus T, buff some of your other abilities like Crackling Jade Lightning. So you'll just kind of have to dive into the talent tree, watch a few guides. This spec will take a little bit more studying than some of the other healer specs on this list. But once you get the hang of it, I do feel like this is a pretty relaxed Mythic Plus healer to play. And I think things just flow very smoothly for the spec. So for these reasons, I feel like it's kind of in the middle somewhere. So I'm going to kind of put them in B tier. There will be a decent learning curve to pick them up. I don't think it's anywhere near these two specs. But once you do get over that learning curve, I do think that the spec plays very smoothly, and it is one of my favorite healers to play. Okay, up next we have Holy Paladin. So Holy Paladin's going to be the sort of APM warriors on this list. You're going to be casting a lot of spells very often, so extremely, extremely good spot healers. So the main issue with Holy Paladin is just how high APM it is, and just your mouse is just kind of all over the place between enemies and your allies. So something like a Mistweaver Monk, you do damage and it just kind of passively heals. You're not spot healing too much. Yes, there are scenarios where you're casting instant cast Vivifies and Soothing Mist, but you really rely mostly on just doing damage and then healing just kind of passively going out. Versus something like a Holy Paladin, you have more control on where your healing goes, but that requires more mouse movement. So the way Holy Paladin plays is you build up Holy Power, and that's called your spender. So you generate Holy Power through your generators, and then you spend it on your really powerful spells like Word of Glory, Light of Dawn. Then you simply target an ally, and you put all that healing into that one target, and that's what gives them that great feeling of spot healing. But the downside of that is it requires tons of mouse movement. So you're generating hundreds of Holy Power throughout the course of a dungeon. Every 5 Holy Power, you have to take your mouse and move it over to a health bar. And when I play Holy Paladin personally, I find myself looking at health bars more than, like ground effects, things I shouldn't be standing in, positioning. And it just takes some time to kind of get used to. So this is kind of a hard alt to play. And this is almost, I feel like, something you have to main. You just kind of have to get reps in to kind of train your eye to kind of go back and forth constantly. Now, one thing that's nice about Holy Paladin, kind of the opposite of Mistweaver Monk, is you don't necessarily have to be in melee range to do healing. You can generate Holy Power just fine without being in melee range. It's not necessarily ideal, but it is doable. And there is also a slight learning curve with all the utility that Holy Paladin brings. So like Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom, Blessing of Sacrifice. It requires some knowledge of each dungeon to be able to get the full value out of a Holy Paladin. It's not like you just press a buff and everybody gets flat stats and it's very passive. This is a very hands-on healing spec to play, and it's going to require a whole bunch of focus to play at 100% efficiency. So for these reasons, I put them in C tier, just pretty much on par with Restoration Druid. So very high APM, a lot of things going on with these two specs. Again, Preservation Evoker really requires playing them in a very specific way with combos. And then Mistweaver Monk, kind of all these three combined to a lesser extent with a much more passive playstyle. Okay, up next, let's take a look at Discipline Priest. So Disc Priest is one of the specs that on the front end look pretty easy. There's not a whole bunch of buttons you have to press. You kind of heal through your damage. So it's kind of very passive healings, very similar again to something like a Mistweaver Monk. But Disc Priest almost falls into the same bucket as something like Preservation Evoker, where you have sort of combos and windows where you do a whole bunch of healing. So I'd say Disc Priest is almost something like the melee version of Mistweaver Monk. You heal pretty passively through the damage that you send out. And one of the downside of Disc Priest is they have sort of windows where they do a whole bunch of healing. And outside of those windows, they don't heal for that much. So we have a spell called Atonement. Let's just go ahead and bring up the tree. So if we look at the top of the tree, we have the spell called Atonement. And this means all the spell damage that you do while Atonement is up will heal your allies. Now, the problem is you don't get 100% uptime on Atonement. It's only about, I'd say it's only up like 70% of the time. So that 30% of the time, you are very vulnerable to damage. And if a big burst phase does go out, a lot of people can die if you don't time this properly. So for this reason, it requires a lot of knowledge of the dungeon before you go into it and where the damage is going to happen. Now, Disc Priest also plays around a pet called our Mindbender down here in the bottom right. So this is one of the things that's not very straightforward about playing Discipline Priest is you're trying to get as much uptime on this Mindbender pet as you possibly can. And that's going to be through casting Smite, which essentially gives cooldown reduction on your Mindbender. And your Mindbender does a whole bunch of passive damage and healing for you. So you kind of have two windows at your disposal. You have your Atonement window, and you also have your Mindbender window. And typically, while one is down, you can send the other kind of back and forth, so that you should always have a window where you can do a whole bunch of healing. You always have one or the other. If both are on cooldown, that's when you're very vulnerable. So there is a bit of a learning curve with Disc Priest, but from an APM perspective, I don't think that it's really that hard to play. You're not having to keep track of a whole bunch of different spells. You have these different windows that you can send a whole bunch of damage and healing in. You have a ton of just super powerful cooldowns like your Rapture, which gives a whole bunch of shields to your entire party. You have really strong spells like Pain Suppression, which reduces all damage taken by 40%. So as keys go higher, the spells get stronger and stronger. So it's not mechanically difficult to play. There's not a lot of things that you're tracking here. You just have to be familiar with your windows. So for these reasons, I put them right on par with Mistweaver Monk. Somewhere, I'd probably say they're a little bit more difficult than something like Mistweaver Monk. So up next, we have Holy Priest. So from a high-end perspective, Holy Priest is actually one of the worst healers at the moment. However, from a beginner standpoint, I think it's one of the better healers to pick up. They are very straightforward, just point-and-click healers. There's not a ton of button bloat on them, and it's pretty easy to direct your healing between single-target spot healing and AoE healing. So from a beginner standpoint, there's really not anything bad I can say about playing Holy Priest. And really, I wish the game was designed, all the other healer specs were designed very similar to something like Holy Priest. I think it'd be easier for people to pick up the role if they just kind of took some of the complexity out of some of these other healer specs. I think you have a lot of people who love the theme of something like Restoration Druid, but would never touch it just due to how difficult it is to heal, and they can't do the content that they want to do in this spec, versus something like Holy Priest. It's so much easier to play. You might not like the theme of the spec quite as much, but you're able to clear heroic raid in it, so that's what you play. So I think that's some of the reason that we see underrepresentation in some of these specs is people don't really want to take the time and the investment to learn them. And I just wish overall healer specs were a little bit more similar to something like Holy Priest, a little bit easier to pick up and play. But yeah, that's sort of my random rant on that. So we are currently running 4 Mythic Plus the Oracle Tree, and you kind of play around Premonition. I have a video on my channel that makes this much easier to play around, but you have these different charges that you go through, and it buffs your spells in different ways, and it looks kind of complicated just kind of looking at the different spells here. And it's very awkward to play with the first few times, but you do get the hang of it pretty quick, especially if you have, some sort of weak aura or something that tells you, which charge of Premonition you're on and what it does. I have a video on it on my channel if you want to check that out. But the way Holy Priest works is you kind of have these Holy Word Serenity charges that you can utilize. Kind of works on a charge-based system, and you press it and it does a whole bunch of healing. And then you will go back and forth with the Lightweaver talent here, and you'll kind of swap between flash heals and heals. And the bulk of your healing rotation is going to be those 3 spells. So it's going to be flash heal, heal, and then Holy Word Serenity. You have spells like Prayer Mending. Prayer Mending also will put a Power Word Shield on the target through Assured Safety. And then you also have a very simple damage rotation. So we haven't really talked about damage rotations too much on this list. And for the most part, they're not too complicated between all the different healer specs, but you can quite literally do the Holy Priest damage rotation in one macro. You can pair Holy Fire with Holy Word Chastise. I have a video on this in my Holy Priest guide if you want to check that out on my channel, but you just quite simply use the macro, you just spam the button, and it does a whole bunch of AoE damage or single target damage, all funneled into one button. So yeah, overall, Holy Priest is just very simple, very straightforward to play, and for these reasons, I'm going to put them in S tier as the easiest Mythic Plus healer to pick up for beginners. Okay, up next we have Restoration Shaman. So Restoration Shaman is probably the only healer on this list that I feel if I have a full mana bar, I can heal through just about anything. It is just such a pug-friendly spec. It does a lot of things passively through chain heal, and it just feels good to play. Now, you do have more things to track on a Restoration Shaman versus something like a Holy Priest. So basically the way this works is you put out Riptides, which will do some passive healing, and they give you procs of something called Tidal Waves, which makes some of your other healing spells quicker and more efficient to press. So the general gameplay loop is Riptide, Healing Surge, Riptide, Chain Heals, Riptide, Healing Waves, just depending on the situation that you're in, but you're kind of weaving these Riptides in and out of your general rotation. And very similar to something like a Holy Priest, it's just very straightforward point and click healer, and it has insane throughput on it. Now, one of the downsides of playing Restoration Shaman is the button bloat. So Restoration Shaman has access to something called totems, and these totems take up a lot of action bars, or a lot of space on your action bars, and there's really nothing you can do about it. It's been that way since Resto Shaman's been introduced to WoW. I do have a video on the Opie add-on. You can check it out. It's just sort of a wheel that pops up, and you can put your totems on it. It does kind of help with button bloat a little bit. Now, another downside of Restoration Shaman is there are a lot of things to track. So we talked about Riptide. You have to track that. We have Tidal Waves. You have to track this. We also have something called Undulation. You have to track this as well. You have High Tides that pop up. These are procs that you kind of have to track. You have Earth Shield that you have to track. You have Water Shield charges that you have to track. So it's not as bad as something like a Restoration Druid, but there is that sort of level of complexity there. And then the final downside of playing something like Restoration Shaman is mana management. So it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot with Restoration Shaman. It's gotten better previously because there have been some buffs to the cost of Chain Heal within the totemic tree, but Chain Heal is inherently just by itself a very expensive spell to press, and if you use it too much, you will be going pretty quick. So sure, you do have a ton of power with Chain Heal. You have pretty much untapped AoE healing while you have mana, but it is very easy to burn through that mana if you are abusing that power too much. So for those reasons, I will be putting Restoration Shaman in the A tier for beginners. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. See you on the next one.